Hi everyone, I'm Geoffrey Botkin and happy 4th of July to all of you. Today it's the 4th in the Northern Hemisphere in the United States of America, and I'm happy to be here and be able to talk to you. I'm taking time today to read to everyone a poem that I think we all need to remember and think about, and then think about even more. It's Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's epic poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And I love it because it's good poetry, it's good English, it's good history. Because this man, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, really put all of himself into his work, all of his life. And from the time, really, he was 3 years old. And I need to tell you just a little bit about his life and his story before I jump into the poem. Because when I hit the poem, what I want to do, I want to read the whole thing through without stopping. And I'm going to be so tempted along the way to want to stop and annotate the poem and talk about the history. But I'll restrain myself. But before I begin, let me just tell you just a little bit about this man's life, because his life is so tightly intertwined with the very history that he's writing about in his poetry. And he did. I mean, his whole life, he was enthralled by the history of his country, and we really should be too, because there's so much providential truth in it at every step of the way. Here we are today at 2020. We are 400 years from the time that the Mayflower sailed, landed on the shore, and these pilgrims, half of whom died in the very first year, set up to the very best of their ability the foundations of a nation. And they married, they began to have children, and the very first baby who was born there in the Plymouth colony was named Elizabeth. And Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is her descendant. He's directly descended from her. And he's descended from, lots of other settlers to the Massachusetts colony. It grew big, and he was born, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the poet, was born in 1807, just one generation removed from the events of the American War of Independence, which is why I want to look at this today. I want to remember him. I want to remember this poem. And I want to remember the history that has led up to the composing of this poem and to the events that made the American War of Independence not only possible but victorious. That's what is really interesting, because we should not have won. We Americans, we should have lost at so many different times during the battle. And General Washington certainly knew that. His generals knew that. And by the way, one of his generals, General Wadsworth, was the grandfather of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So do you see? And as he grew up as a boy, he grew up and spent time on the farm of General Wadsworth, his grandfather, learning about the war, learning about these things. So he is writing this poem about the midnight ride of Paul Revere, not from any position of ignorance or speculation or myth. And we've got to remember, it's such a beautiful poem. As I'm reading it, please don't dare think that it's some kind of made-up story. It almost sounds like it could be, because it's such beautiful poetry, but it's not. It's a real story about a real man who made a real ride. And of course he can't include everything that happened, but at the end of my reading, I'll try to tell you just a couple of stories, if we have a little bit more time, of what really happened on that ride. Some of the events that couldn't be included that really give to us some perspective on the character of this man who made the ride and why he made it. And we need to know these things. So back to the poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was born in 1807 in the Massachusetts colony. Where he was born in Portland is actually now part of the state of Maine, but it was at that time, the colony was huge. Massachusetts colony was very big. His dad was a lawyer, and as I mentioned, his grandfather was General Wadsworth, and some of his other ancestors included Richard Warren on his mom's side, William Brewster, who was without whose help and without whose sacrifice and without whose vision, the Pilgrims probably never would have made it to the New World. Oh, I wish I could just stop and talk about all these people, because their lives are so interesting. William Brewster was a brilliant young scholar, just like Henry Wadsworth would be later on. He was a brilliant scholar at Cambridge. The world was open to him. He had all the contacts. He had all the foundation for being one of the most successful men in Great Britain. As a young man, he as I said, he met people at Cambridge. He was introduced to Ambassador Davidson, one of the most powerful ambassadors of the entire nation, one of the favorites of Queen Elizabeth. And he got the appointment to the Netherlands, which was the choice appointment for the court of St. James at that point. Now, something happened, though, and Brewster's world totally came all apart and was turned completely upside down. Not unlike the way that many of you are having your whole lives and worlds turned upside down right now by the pandemic, by the failure of the economy, the collapse of the economy, the crime and the riots and everything. Our country is far different than what it was in March just of this year. But we don't have to ever despair about that. When we see history, it was Churchill who said, the farther back we can see in history, the easier it is to see forward. The farther forward we can see clearly, because we understand what's going to happen. That's why I'm so optimistic about the future and what's going to happen to all of us. I believe we can share an informed optimism together because of the providence of God, what we can see, and how the providence of God works through history. How it worked in this time, it worked in William Brewster's life. What happened to him? Well, back to his story real quickly. Things went horrible. When Ambassador Davidson fell out of favor with the Queen, he was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. And his assistant, William Brewster, could easily have found time in jail. He had to lay low for a while, and then things didn't really get better. They continued to get worse and worse and worse. Davidson got out of the tower. Things could have been better, but there was religious persecution, and Brewster was a man of principle, and he was hounded because of his religious principle. From place to place to place, he was arrested, put in jail. He got out of jail. He had to flee his own country. He went to the Netherlands, hooked up with these pilgrims who were over there, and then was having a family, trying to get back onto his feet. Things were not going well in the Netherlands at all, and they all realized they were going to have to pack up again, leave the Netherlands, and the plan was to go to the New World. So he called his friend, well, he contacted his friend, you don't call him, Sir Francis Drake, from his days at court. And he said, Sir Francis, you've got this massive big fleet that you've accumulated. Do you have any boats that we could simply use to get these pilgrims from the old world into the new world? And Sir Francis said, well, yeah, I've got two old ones, the Speedwell and the Mayflower, and you can have use of those. So they tried the Speedwell. It was too leaky. They had to leave it behind, but they got on the Mayflower, took the riskiest trip, and one of the riskiest voyages in all of history. They made it to the New World. They started, half of them died in the first year. But William Brewster, whose life had been so totally turned upside down, invested in something that was a lot more important than himself, and saw fruit like we'll never fully understand until heaven. We can talk to him and see what happened. But as I mentioned, 35 million descendants today from those first settlers in the New World at Plymouth, getting off the boat, getting off the Mayflower, and trying to make a go of it. And William Brewster was their leader, their governor for two decades and 4 years before he died. And the fruit of his life, even though he never did have fame and fortune and riches from Great Britain, which he might have had, his life was turned upside down, but he was able to do something with it that had far more value and bore much more fruit, even though he was never a wealthy man, ever. He collected books, the books that he could during his lifetime, but that's about all he ever did have of any kind of wealth. Now, okay, back to our poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. When he was born where he was, there was no such thing as public schools. That didn't happen in Massachusetts until the days of Horace Mann, who organized the state to force parents to take their children and put them into a government school system with a government curriculum. And he had to do it at the point of bayonet. because the parents didn't want to do that. So back in 1807, it was before those days. There were no public schools, but there were things like mostly what happened was homeschooling in almost every single family, and literacy was sky high in the colonies and now the states at that time. And there was, close to where they lived, a dame school. A dame school is a school organized by a respectable older woman. Her children are probably gone, or she may be a widow, and she has a lot to offer. She's a distinguished woman of the community, and she brings young children in. And she took in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow when he was just 3 years old, and he was a star pupil. And and this was common, starting school at age 2 or 3 at home, and 3 at a dame school, and he really was a great learner, and then began to attend a different private situation when he was 6 years old, learned Latin fluently, and which helped him all his life. And I do believe that the structure of Latin, not the classical aspects of it, but the grammatical structure of Latin can help us in our understanding of using English, mastering English, using English, the English language, and as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow learned to do. He also learned many other languages, but he wrote his poetry in English. And he became a beloved poet. He became an inspiration to many other poets around the world. And one of his primary subjects was the providence of God, as we'll see here in this poem. So where did he get his name? He was named after his uncle Henry Wadsworth. His uncle had died just a couple of years prior to Henry's birth, the poet's birth, because he was killed in America's first war with Islam in the early 1800s at the time of Thomas Jefferson's administration. And if you don't know the story, you really do need to know this story. We had just finished our prolonged conflict with the mother country, which we didn't want to get into. We didn't want war. We never wanted war. We tried to fight it as quickly and efficiently as we could to bring an end to it, force their surrender so that we could have peace. Well, we won the peace, but as soon as we won the peace, we were a broken country, a brand new country, a weak country. We had war debt. We didn't have a navy. We didn't have a military. We didn't want to ever need those things. But as our businessmen, with our new free economy and the new freedoms they had, began to get out and try to do business on the open waters in the sea and do commerce with different nations internationally, they were hijacked by Muslim pirates who stole all their material, all their goods, all their women, all their children, all the sailors, to put into the sex slave traffic, which was a multi-billion pound operation at that time. And it was participated in by all the Muslim kingdoms and all the Muslim nations at that time. And so we fell right into it, and there was not much we could do. We even tried to bribe them to leave us alone, but they wouldn't. Two of our ambassadors, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, went to London to try to meet with one of the Islamic ambassadors, whose name was Aja, and said, "Why are you doing this to us? We're at peace with you. We're not at war with you. We haven't done a single thing that's been hostile or has injured you." And so this ambassador, who's Muslim, just gave them a theology lesson from the Quran and said, you've got to understand this. This is who we are as Muslims. We have permission from Allah to do anything to you that we want to do because you are infidels. We can steal your women. We can rape them. We can put them into the slave trade. We can take your children. We can raid your shipping. We can sink your ships. We can steal everything on them. That's just how it is. And the contents of these discussions are actually left for us in the U.S. Congressional Record. You can read them there. But to make a long story short, the bribes never did work. The only thing that would work was we had to finally commit money in our country to build a navy and send a navy over there, load the cannons, fire the cannons, and try to win the conflict in that way with them. And one of the first great battles, the Battle of Tripoli, is the great battle, the sea battle, which actually did kill Henry Wadsworth, the uncle of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, when he was just a young U.S. naval lieutenant. Now, another young lieutenant who was killed in the same battle, I've got to tell you this story. His name was James Decatur, young naval lieutenant, was commanding his ship, was in battle against a Muslim pirate. He was defeating the Muslim pirate, and here's what happened. The Muslim pirate knew he was losing, knew he was going to lose his ship, was going to lose his crew, and he did what you do in naval battles. These are according to the rules of war that have been known for centuries. You strike your colors to show that you're willing to surrender. So he did that, and James Decatur knew, okay, my enemy is surrendering. I need to now stop, fighting him so that his ship won't sink. I can save the lives of his men. I can take possession of the ship and the booty that's on the ship. And that's what he proceeded to do. He sailed up close. He came alongside the pirate vessel. He boarded the pirate vessel, and just as he did, the Muslim pirate captain raised his colors again, put his pistol to the face of James Decatur and fired it and killed him on the spot. Well, the word quickly spread to the older brother of James Decatur, who was another naval officer involved in the battle with his own ship, Stephen Decatur, who became one of the most famous military leaders of the young United States. And he took off. He grabbed 6 sailors. He took off after that Muslim pirate who had murdered his brother. He caught up to him. He boarded the ship. It was hand-to-hand combat. And he almost didn't win, but he did win. There was no surrender. The Muslims would not well, actually, I think 2 of them did surrender after most had been killed. But the murderous Muslim pirate captain who had killed James Decatur was killed in that conflict. So that's just a taste of what we're doing today. Is we're remembering history, aren't we? We're remembering the name of Henry Wadsworth, a brave naval lieutenant who was killed by bringing up his name and bringing up his story. And his sister was married and had a little baby and then she named him Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And that's whose life we're looking at right now. So are you ready for the poem? I want to get into this. Let me just tell you very quickly. Alert you to a couple of words that you may be unfamiliar with. The word mystic, when you hear it, is the name of a river that flows right around there in Boston. Somerset is a British battleship that is floating right there in the harbor, in Boston Harbor. The greatest line of this poem is this one. The fate of a nation. Excuse me. The fate of a nation was riding that night. The fate of a nation was riding that night. And see, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow understood that. So let's read this poem. I'm going to try to rush through it very quickly. See how far we get. Are you ready? Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1 if by land and 2 if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. And then he said good night, and with muffled oar silently rowed to the Charlestown shore. Just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon, like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. And then he climbed the tower of the Old North Church by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade. By the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath in the churchyard lay the dead, in their night campment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear like a sentinel's tread the watchful night wind as it went, creeping along from tent to tent, and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, and now he gazed at the landscape far and near. And then, impetuous, stamped the earth and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the Old North Church as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle. The bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark, struck out by a steed flying fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night. And the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides, and under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of its steed as he rides. He was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge to Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog that felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. He was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, black and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work that they would look upon. He was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadow brown. And one was safe and asleep in his bed who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest. In the books you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. And so through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm. A cry of defiance and not of fear. A voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen and hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. And that's the end of the poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And it has educated people. It has given them facts of the case and in the history. Not all the facts, but they are laid out very accurately here in order of what happened. One book that I would love to recommend to all of you is Paul Revere's Ride by David Hackett Fisher. It's, no matter how old you are, and if your children can't read, moms, you could read this book to them. They will love it. They'll keep asking you to keep going. One of the things that is so important to know is just what a man of character he was. One of the things that happened on his ride, he was actually captured by British regulars and pulled up. There were actually, at one point, 10 of them around him. He was surrounded. The commander threatened to blow his brains out if he didn't tell the truth. He told all the truth. He told so much truth about what was going on that night. He knew more intelligence about what the British were doing than this commander actually knew himself, which really spooked him a little bit. I mean, to hear their conversation that happened. And he kept quizzing Paul Revere, and Paul Revere just kept coming out with all this intel that he had. Why? Because he had such a network of people that he had built up over the years. This is what was amazing about Paul Revere. And when he lit out that night to warn all the most important people, he knew exactly which houses to go to, which paths to take, which shortcuts to take, because he knew all of them. He knew exactly when he got to which house, how to greet the house, what corner of the house to go, which bedroom the man lived in who needed to hear these things. Sometimes all he would have to do was strike the edge of a house with his club and keep riding, and the man would know what needed to have happen. That night, actually, there were 2 riders. The other one was William Dawes, but in contrast, he rode hard. He did his very best that night, but he didn't have the level of knowledge to know where to go, to whom to go, and so he was a little bit too ignorant to be of great value that night, but not Paul Revere. Paul Revere was the networker of the American War for Independence. He could pull people together. He could pull different factions together. He could bring unity. He was a man of peace. He could bring peace, and he helped the war get underway in a way that it could be concluded very quickly. And this is the legacy of his life. Now, one of the remarkable aspects of Providence that we must touch on is this unity that was able to happen. When the word went out around Boston and all those villages, Lexington and Concord, everyone was of one heart, one soul, one mind. They knew exactly what to do. The men who came out to fight the British knew exactly how to do that. There was unity that there had not been before in the 1740s, in the early part of the 1750s. And some of our founders, like the old man, Benjamin Franklin, made comment of this. He remarked about how things were not going very well with Great Britain, and the tyranny could be getting worse and worse and worse over the years, and he lamented that there may not be a solution for the colonies to come together and resist Great Britain because there was not enough unity. In fact, there was way too much disunity and childishness and bickering and self-seeking. And he wrote about those things. But John Adams said later on, he said something happened that turned everything around. And it happened in 1750. He credited one sermon by one preacher, a preacher named Jonathan Mayhew, who was honoring the 100th anniversary of the beheading of Charles I, in England. The beheading of Charles I, who had been taken before the courts of England and tried through due process, and then more due process, and then more due process. They didn't want to have to do this to him, but he was so guilty of treason. They had no other choice. And they pronounced him guilty. He was beheaded at Whitehall. And then the country enjoyed several years of peace after that, under a republic. And so the sermon given by Jonathan Mayhew reminded the people they don't have to live under tyranny. There are things that average people can do. The citizenry who are subjects of the king can do and must do. And one of the phrases that became very popular is that submission to tyrants is service to Satan, and you simply can't do that. So the people began to come together to focus their attention on getting rid of the tyranny or doing whatever they had to do. First, they appealed to the king. Finally, as a very last resort, they had to fight and resist because the king would not honor the Declaration of Independence. He wouldn't honor the new country that had been formed, so that we could go about our own business in our own way and have an upright and righteous government that had no tyranny. The king wouldn't honor that. So there was a war, they lost, and we won. And so that's where I'll stop today. It's a story that we have to remember. We have to be thinking about this. We have to be thinking about all the interconnecting links that made all these things happen. Going back to, the trial and the execution of Charles I is connected to all this. The books, Vindicii contra Tyrannos, about what happens and how you decide when you have to go to war with a tyrant. The book Lex Rex, which came before that. These are all parts of the foundation of our history. Men have worked through these things a lot. And we need to remember these things. We need to honor the tribulations and the trials that they've been through. Many have died in simply trying to be able to give a better future for their children because they were looking to the future optimistically, the way that we need to now. And yes, now we're facing a time in the history of our nation which will require a lot of sacrifice on the part of people to begin rebuilding the foundations of the country at a local level. And that's what we all are going to have to come together with and do together with unity. And many of you will have to be the leaders who lead the way in doing that, because so many of us have not had experience doing it. We don't know even where to begin. Please do your homework. Study your history. Find out how others have done this in the past. After times of great turmoil, times of upheaval, times of warfare, times of sickness, times of plague, men have emerged. They've risen to the occasion, and they've been able to bring about and reestablish foundations of peace and order and the rule of law. That's the task that's before us. I'm really optimistic that we can do it. Continue to study your history, and may the Lord bless you on this 4th of July.
To connect with us directly, please visit geoffreybotkin.com and send any questions or thoughts that you might have to questions@geoffreybotkin.com.